Before we begin, I want to thank the sponsor of today's episode, RevenueCat. RevenueCat makes it easy for app developers to build, analyze, and grow in-app purchases and subscriptions on iOS, Android, and the web. No server code required. With a few lines of code, get in-app purchase infrastructure, analytics, and integrations without managing servers. If you checked out our previous episode with Andy from RevenueCat, you know how much RevenueCat can help with some of the difficult infrastructure, even with the new updates in StoreKit 2. They make in-app purchases easier. They solve the painful edge cases, manage subscription status across platforms, and cut implementation time from months to hours, so you can focus on building your app. There's some great automated reporting tools, some great analytics, customer lists, and filters and segments. I highly recommend you check RevenueCat and get started today. Once you've done that, go ahead and check out their YouTube channel too. They have some great services there and great videos to show you how to get started, whether you want to use a CocoaPod or a Swift package, as well as some of the new tools they have in their dashboard. So go to RevenueCat.com, get started with your brand new app today. Thank you, RevenueCat, for sponsoring today's show. Hello and welcome to another episode of Empower Apps. I'm your host, Leo Dion. Today I'm joined by Ellen Shapiro. Ellen, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, man.
I'll let you start by introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ellen Shapiro. I am a developer advocate at Apollo GraphQL. I've been working on their iOS SDK for the last couple of years, and now I'm sort of shifting gears to helping people actually use the SDK.
That's awesome. We've had Chris Tapps was on talking about GraphQL.
Yeah. Chris Tapps is, he's really awesome, and he's done some fun stuff with GraphQL, and I know he was doing a lot of work on WebSocket stuff for a while, but I know he's got many hats on. Yes,
exactly. So I've been wanting to have you on for a ton of reasons, and then I saw you were doing the 360 talk on DocC, which I've been jumping into. So I'm really excited to talk about that today. What's been your impression of DocC, I guess?
I think DocC is really a great way to sort of, start to get more benefits out of writing good header doc. Like that, I think is sort of the basic level of using it. The other thing is just providing more organization than just like, here's a whole pile of documentation. Not really having any way of organizing it. I think that's something where, when you have documentation that's automatically generated from your code, one of the things that can really suck is it's just like, this is just all organized like alphabetically, or like whether it's a class or a struct. And it's like, does that actually matter? Or does it more matter like, What are you trying to accomplish with this? And so that's definitely something that I think is really helpful. I think it's really big because it gives a lot of people, like, it's clear that this is what Apple uses internally. My favorite indication of this is that when you fail to add header doc to something, you actually get something that says no overview available. You're just like, oh, good. Now I feel like an Apple engineer. Yay.
Now your documentation really does look like Apple's.
Yeah, exactly. And it's definitely something where there's a lot of interesting things about that. But I think the biggest is that they have a whole system for making all of this work, and a lot of developers, there are some developers who have their own system or use something like Jazzy or the markdown documentation stuff that I've been using with Apollo. But like doing all of that and setting that up is really time consuming. And so having that as something that's built into the IDE. Thank you, Jesus.
No, but that's the thing is like it's built into Xcode 13, so you could like see it right there. And like at first, when I was setting it up, we'll get into more technical details, but when I was setting it up, it's like, oh gosh, I got to set up a web server and all this stuff. But like, you don't actually need that to like test the documentation. You can just build it and then see it in the help files. So yeah,
and that's really nice. And like there are a couple of like convenience things for actually like serving the documentation. There's an open source package that's basically like a Swift server that you can run that is like basically you can just serve.
Right.
And it's definitely, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, before we get more deep into it, what exactly is DocC and why is it called DocC?
Yeah, so the C in DocC is for compiler. So what it does is it takes basically everything that the Swift compiler knows about your documentation and uses it to do things like create symlinks, be able to link between different symbols within a particular library. And the sort of really basic version of DocC is that. The other thing that it does is it sort of takes all that information and any additional information that you've put into what's called a documentation catalog and uses that to sort of make a more organized version of your docs. And so, there's sort of the bare minimum of what it can do is it can take your docs and generate them in a fairly unorganized fashion, but like in a way that makes it possible for people to search for those docs within Xcode and within the Xcode documentation. And you can actually, just export DocC archives and have people be able to read them within Xcode themselves.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah. Once you get into, I'm going to add a documentation catalog. What that does is it allows you to sort of say, okay, I'm actually going to do a little bit more work to organize all of this. I'm going to have potentially some articles. I'm going to have, something resembling what Apple has on the landing page for each of their frameworks, where it's just like, hey, using Apollo as an example, it's like, hey, like, do you want to make network calls? Do you want to use the information that just came back? Do you want to interact with the cache? Having that be the organizing principle versus is this a struct versus an enum versus a class, which is not actually all that helpful.
Right. Which is like the default way of layout for most documentation tools, which is not, like you said, doesn't really tell a story.
Yeah. And the nice thing about all of this is that, what it does under the hood is that it generates JSON that is, if you're using Apple's tooling, it's served using like a Vue.js app when you show it as a website. But the nice thing about it being all JSON is that if you want to take the JSON and do stuff like convert it into a static website or something like that, then that's possible in it's certainly something that's not like easy because some of the JSON definition is still being worked on, but it's something where you can start to generate more custom stuff rather than just using Apple stuff. So it's really nice because I think for a lot of smaller frameworks, like people don't have time to really deal with putting really cool looking documentation together. And this allows smaller frameworks to basically do that with a fairly low level of effort. And it's pretty sweet.
I thought that was one of the most interesting things from your talk was the idea that behind it all is Vue.js, which I didn't even realize. I know it renders a bunch of JSON metadata and then uses that in the website. And then that's why you like need to do all these rewrites and stuff in order to make sure that the JSON calls work. But I didn't realize it was Vue.js all underneath. Is that true about like the actual Apple documentation as well? Like as far as you know?
As far as I know, it's actually just Vue.js.
Okay.
Three instances of Vue.js in a trench code or something. But it's because I know that they use Vue.js particularly for tutorials on the web.
Okay.
And I know that they're a review shop when it comes to sort of their front end web stack. So I think from a standpoint of how is this stuff displayed in the Xcode documentation window, I think it's using the underlying JSON, but I'm not positive.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I really liked about this was that it doesn't, like you kind of said, if you already are using current documentation comment stuff in your code, like you're already more than halfway there, I would say, as far as getting this stuff done.
Yeah. I think it's really nice because it sort of rewards you for doing the right thing.
Right. Exactly.
If you've added header documentation to your public methods, that's a huge step in the right direction into getting this stuff generated and having it look good and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And it is something where some of the stuff that DocC powers, like links, basically one thing that you can do is you can link to other symbols within your documentation by using like double backticks, basically. And you can actually click on those links in the header doc and have it jump you to whatever that symbol is in your code. So that's super convenient. And it's something where it's basically taking what we already have and just making it nicer and making it easier to get out in a format that is usable.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think are the next steps after you have pretty much cleaned up your code comments, right? As far as really taking advantage of DocC, what do you think are the next steps there?
Yeah, definitely step one is clean up your header doc, which is there's one feature that's missing from this that I really wish existed, which is basically a way to be like, here's all the stuff that doesn't have documentation.
Yeah, right. Or even somebody out there build a linter for it. Like, yeah, I totally agree.
I think there's some kinds of linter for it, but it's definitely something where, like. And then there's a few things that would be nice, like, hey, what would be great is if you could just put this error message as the documentation for an error enum. That would be pretty cool, that I don't have to write all of that twice. But it's definitely something where like that's the first place to start. Is just like make sure everything that is public is documented. And as of right now, I don't think there's a way to get it to generate documentation for stuff that's not public within a framework. But yeah, that's the biggest place to start. The next place is really taking advantage of the documentation catalog and looking at the sort of article and like table of contents types of thing to really give people a clearer organization of like, here's where all this stuff is. I think one of the things that's really nice is that the sidebar in the Xcode documentation really leverages the organization that you put into that table of contents doc for your framework, and it makes it much easier for people to really find what they need in order to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish with your framework.
Yeah, that's like the one thing I found when I first built the documentation was, like you said, it just organizes it in these like struct protocols, enums. Totally useless, right? Better than nothing, but totally useless.
Yeah, and then, I was going to say, better than nothing, but not actually all that helpful.
Right. And then the first thing I did was learning how to like organize my types into actual like tutorials, but sections of like, if this is what you want to do, here are the types for that. If this is what you want to do, here are the types for that.
Yeah.
And kind of organizing it in that fashion, I found super helpful.
And then the nice thing about that is that you can in that sort of table of contents document, you can link to both sort of your symbols for your various things. One thing that I didn't mention earlier, like that this integration with the Swift compiler gives you is like, as you're writing out all these documentations, you get autocomplete so that like, if you have something that has like stuff, if you write something that has a really long name or something that is just like, I never spelled this right on the first try. Good news. The compiler can actually help you with that.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's really nice to be able to link to a combination of just sort of generated documentation and then a more article-like piece of documentation where that sort of draws together everything that you're trying to say. Because I think that's something at Apollo that we've had some problems with, is that people leave feedback on our docs pages that are just generated documentation. It's like, but how do I use this? And it's like, there's another little thing right over there that says, here's how you use this. But people don't actually see that. So it's something where having the ability to link those things in the documentation catalog is really nice.
Right. Yeah. So the next thing, and the thing I haven't jumped into yet, but I want to, is articles. Excuse me.
No doubt.
Yeah. The next thing I want to jump into that I'm trying to learn to do is articles and tutorials. When should you use one or over the other? And what's their proper place in the overall documentation scheme?
That's a good question. I think, a tutorial is very much here is a step-by-step way of doing this. It's something where, you're basically hand-holding people, walking them through stuff. The DocC stuff has actually been used to generate stuff like Apple's Catalyst tutorial and some of their SwiftUI tutorials. So if you want to take a look at how Apple handles that, I think that's a really big thing. What I find to be much more useful for articles is just here's some theory or explanation, or here's how all these pieces fit together. It's definitely something where, once you actually start to be okay, I'm really going to try to do this. The first place to start is just okay, how does all of this fit together in terms of what is someone trying to do? And then where you might want an article is more sort of how do I explain what's happening here? How do I give people the sort of theoretical understanding to understand, okay, I'll just use an example from Apollo. Hey, you're putting you're adding new network interceptors. What does that do? Why are they there? What are those things, and how does that work? Whereas, a tutorial is more just hey, here's how to do X. It's very much sort of means to an end kind of things. So yeah.
Does it have to have a visual? Does it have to have a visual element to be a tutorial? Most of the tutorials that Apple puts out, like you said, they're Catalyst or SwiftUI based, but with your GraphQL stuff or with my RSS reader thing, I see a tutorial as helpful, but I don't see the visual element to it that you would get with most UI frameworks.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, one of the things that's nice about it is you can link code in it as well as just images. Okay. And that's really helpful in terms of just sort of being able to highlight the portion of the code that you're talking about. And, obviously with the UI stuff, you're able to put tons of images and stuff like that in there. For what we do, we have a bunch of stuff that you have to sort of set up to get code generation going. That involves many, many screenshots of Xcode.
Right. Okay.
So it's definitely something where there are things where it's helpful to have that visual representation, but the place where I would draw the line is not, is there visual content or is there not visual content? To me, it's more, are you sort of step-by-step showing somebody how to do something, or are you having a more general explanation of why does this exist? Or what is sort of the theory behind why you do X? So why does Apollo generate code based on operations rather than based on just the schema or something like that? That makes sense. That's the kind of thing.
My thought or my approach to it was going to be start off with an article, because articles are so much simpler than tutorials. And then okay, now I know what I can do step by step. Now let's transfer that over to tutorials. Because once I started deep diving into tutorials before our recording, I was just okay, yeah, this is a lot of metadata I have to attach to it.
Yeah, it's definitely much more metadata, and it is definitely something where, like, if you have the time to do that, it's great because it is something that puts out something that's really, really easy for for your developers to
Right.
use.
Yeah.
The question is just sort of like, do you have time to break it down that much? And I
Right.
think
Right.
the number of places that have that, or a number of people who are willing to take that time, because that is going to be time that you spend away from developing the framework that you're working on.
Right. Right.
And I think it is something where it's just like, it really depends on how many users you have, whether you're doing this for free or whether you're doing this as part of your job, things like that. But I think it is something where having that be available to everyone is actually pretty awesome. Like, it's really something that, can democratize, being able to have a good step-by-step tutorial for a lot of stuff. Like, I've written tutorials for Ray Wenderlich for years and years and years, and that is an involved process. And this is, I think any kind of content creation like this is a super involved process because you have to sort of really think through, like, what am I doing? How am I organizing all of this? And then get to deal with, like, okay, and now I have to make it all fit into whatever the content management system is. In this case, sort of Apple's way of, they've added some extensions to Markdown that let you sort of create these blocks that are eventually sort of generated into individual steps. The upshot of it is that, like, somebody else actually already built the whole system, which I know that on the Wenderlich team, like, they have a whole team that built the system that they use.
Right.
So it's definitely something where, it makes it much more possible to do these step-by-step things. And I think that, like, the thing where you can really see, like, only one step at a time is actually pretty sweet, because that is something that I think people get stuck on a lot when they're reading like a big long tutorial, is just sort of like, oh man, where am I even with all of this?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
So
like with Syndicate, like, I have a couple ideas about, like, oh, what if you want to import a WordPress feed, or what if you want to import a YouTube channel as kind of like a tutorial. But then, like I said, once I got into it, I was just like, oh man, I need to add this image and this header and this thing, and then break it down.
Yeah.
So stay tuned on the article first, and then I'll get to the tutorial, hopefully, eventually. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's definitely something that, I think it's worth sort of reminding yourself, like, coming up with a table of contents that, like, actually organizes everything in a sensible fashion is not that bad. Coming up with articles that, like, really explain stuff clearly, that's a skill. That's something, like, that's something where it can be really difficult to communicate this stuff clearly. And, like, this is something that I've been working on at Apollo, is just sort of like, okay, how do I step out of, like, my own head where I have all of the information about how all of this works, and into the head of someone who is just starting to use this, and explain to them, like, okay, like, this is how all of this works. This is how all of these pieces fit together. And that's definitely something where that's much more of a writing exercise than, like, a technical exercise.
Right.
And it's definitely something where, like, honestly, some of the most useful stuff that I've read around that is more just, like, books about, like, information architecture and stuff like that, where it's just like, how do you think about information and get it into a way of thinking that, like, makes it easy for people who are not familiar with something to learn about it. And yeah, like, I don't know, it's really interesting to me, because, like, I don't know, people whine about Apple's docs all the time. And it is something where you have seen them taking a bunch of their older docs and really updating them using what appears to be the same system. And it's really interesting to sort of see, like, okay, now as they're really fleshing out some of this stuff, there's things that are really coming in that are really helpful. But it is definitely, like, writing docs is like, yeah, it's a whole thing. But it's I think it's something where again, if you're just getting started, like the bare minimum you have to do is actually document your headers. And then the next thing to do is like add a table of contents that organizes stuff.
Yep.
And then that's where you sort of stop and say, do I have time? Do I have motivation? Do I have the user base to justify taking these things where I would normally just like write a lot of different information and put it in there?
Yep.
You know, I think it's something where a lot of people put some of the stuff in like READMEs and stuff at this point. And being able to put it in documentation that lives with your framework is really nice, because it means that like people don't have to like constantly go back to GitHub and be like, wait, how does this work?
Right. Because it's right there.
Yeah.
One of the things, I don't want to jump into more advanced stuff, but I'm going to anyways. What the heck is a DocC extension?
So a DocC extension is basically something where you have your symbol. So like your class, your struct, your enum, whatever. And you have your inline header doc. But then you decide, okay, I want to write way more information about this so that people have much more context. What you can do is you can add a DocC extension file and essentially just write a whole bunch of documentation for that symbol in its own file, so that it's essentially not just taking up tons and tons of space on your file that like makes it harder to parse the actual code. There's pluses and minuses to doing that. Like personally, I prefer to just keep everything in one place. And
right.
But it's definitely something where if you
Can
have
it help with like organization, maybe? Like if you want to organize it differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is something where like if instead of writing like individual articles that you link back to, you'd rather just like write all of the documentation for how to use a thing, like it's like, okay,
in the class. Yeah.
You know, just put it all in one place. That's certainly something that you can do. And I think personally, I haven't found that to be super useful, but
Okay.
It really depends on how you decide to architect your documentation. Like it's definitely something where, you know, if you look at some Apple documentation, there's some stuff where it's like, what is this? And there's like one line of text. And it's like, yep, that's exactly what it says in the header doc. And then there's like, you know, and then there's some objects that are documented with like fairly elaborate examples with like images and here's how you do this and here's some more links to other things. And I think that's certainly a piece that, depending on how you want to do that, that's one way of doing it. I think for me, I kind of like the article way of doing it a little bit more, just because, you know, I think one thing that I've seen repeatedly is that if you're just putting all of your documentation into header doc, it doesn't actually get updated as often, especially when you're making changes, and particularly if it's living in another file. But it is something where, you know, it's something where if that's the way that you want to organize your documentation, you totally can. And you can sort of like, once you actually start to use DocC, you can kind of start to understand like some of these places in Apple's documentation, say, okay, they probably created a separate object for this, because otherwise like this would take up like 3/4 of the file. So
Right. Do you want? Yeah, I guess we could talk about hosting your actual documentation. So I was able to set it up. I found some posts by Joe Duffy on how to set it up with Apache or Netlify, which is where I ended up hosting my docs. That worked awesome. That worked fantastically. I just set up a GitHub action to build it and post it to Netlify. What have you found like some of the challenges with hosting this besides the rewrite stuff you have to add? That seems like the only thing that's taking it away from just flat out static site.
Because it's
paradigm.
I think that's the thing that's a little bit weird to me, is that it's not a static site generator, just because it's like it's using static data. I don't understand why it's not a static site generator.
Right.
but to an extent, I kind of understand it. But it just because of like that, I think is more of an artifact of how Vue works than anything else. But I think for me, like, I have no idea what I'm doing with deploying websites. I don't know what the hell is going on. The thing that I found in terms of things that can be helpful. So there's a thing called DocC ZZ, which is they've got a bunch of projects that make it easier to work with DocC, and potentially turn some of these JSON files into static sites. And one of the things that they have is they basically set up a fairly simple server-side Swift site to just you check out the project and then you do Swift run, you hand it a DocC archive, and you're done. So that's a really nice way of doing that. In terms of how to actually deploy that anywhere, no idea. And,
I'll link to my GitHub action so people can take a look at how I'm doing it.
Yeah.
That's the one thing is just once you get over the read-write stuff, the rewrite stuff, if you're doing Apache or Netlify or Nginx or whatever, like once you get that added, then you're good to go, it seems like.
Yeah. And it's definitely one of those things where like, having to rewrite URLs on the fly is a little bit weird. And it's, I'm a little bit like, okay, how does this work with SEO and stuff like that? But I'm sure there's some way that it does.
I know there's Vue.js for SEO, so there's probably something that's handling that.
I'm sure there's something. But I think, it is a little bit limiting that like, you have to have your documentation at the like /documentation, and then you have to have tutorials at /tutorials. And like, you can't necessarily make it like a subdirectory type thing of another thing. It's a little bit weird from that standpoint, like if you're trying to add it on to an existing website. But it is something where it's just like, this is the batteries included version of what you're doing. Sometimes the batteries are bigger than you actually need them to be.
Right.
And so, it's definitely one of those things where like Apple's trying to make it so that you can do all this stuff fairly easily. From a standpoint of like being a web developer. But if you're someone who's like, I don't know what I'm doing, that can be the challenge, getting that set up. Yeah, but what you're talking about with like setting up a GitHub action and having it publish in Netlify, like that's basically the idea of like what they want you to do with this is basically have it be something where whenever you publish whenever you publish a new commit on your main, then it'll have something that just, goes and takes your DocC archive and posts it somewhere.
Right. Or Xcode Cloud, right? For the few people that use that.
Yeah, probably. I got access to that, and I have used it exactly 0 times since then. So,
I got you beat by 1. Good. Okay. What else do you want to talk about as far as DocC? I was going to go over some of the challenges that folks have faced with it or questions that they had.
Yeah, I think one thing, I keep talking about framework when I'm talking about DocC, and I think one thing that is useful to know and that can be frustrating for some people is that DocC is only for documenting frameworks. Yeah. You can't sort of document an application, and it seems like the sort of workaround for that Apple would have you have is like, well, just if you have stuff that you want to document, pull it out into a framework and then document that.
Right.
And it's certainly something where from a best practices standpoint, there's some advantages to that, but it's also something where that can also introduce all sorts of weirdness.
Right.
So the one thing that really annoys me is that you can't link to documentation for anything that you've imported. So like if you've imported UIKit, you can't link to like UI label or something like that. You can only use the double backtick link to link to things within your within your actual framework. And so that's also annoying from a standpoint of like, if you want to try to link to something in the Swift standard library, you can't really link to that. And you know, it is something where it's just like, it's much more of an inconvenience than like, oh no, this is a deal breaker. But it is something where, particularly on Apollo, we have a couple of sub libraries. So we have one for SQLite and we have one for WebSockets. And it's something where we'd love to be able to refer to a bunch of types that are in the main Apollo library in that documentation. If we're using DocC, we're not able to do that. So
is there any workarounds for that?
I mean, the biggest workaround is basically just like link to the actual web page where.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Right. Yeah, which is not great, but it's better than nothing, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say it's certainly not ideal, but it's better than nothing. And you know, it is one of those things where like, you know, that is a workaround, but I think it's something where to me, it doesn't make sense that like you can't link to anything that's either in the standard lib or that's a symbol in something that you've imported in your library, because at that point, DocC should know from the Swift compiler that like, oh, all these other symbols are available. The other thing that I've seen that's a little bit annoying is that if you add an extension to an external type, so either like if you add an extension on string, that extension doesn't actually get documented. So it's something, weird. Yeah, it's kind of annoying. So if you have like a separate file where you've added an extension for a type that's internal to your library, then that gets documented. But if you have a file where you're just adding like string extensions and other convenient stuff, the documentation does not get generated, which is really annoying. So that's one where it's just like, you know, particularly for libraries like ours that add a bunch of convenience
helpers and stuff. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That can be really frustrating. And so it does sort of encourage, okay, well then make some kind of wrapper around that so that people can just use it rather than having it be extensions. But it is something where it's like, yeah, but it's really nice to use that as an extension. There's a reason that we're doing that as an extension.
Exactly.
So
yeah, it goes against the whole point. So where do you think, obviously they said that they're going to open source DocC.
Yes. Yeah, they said they do it by the end of the year. I'm assuming that means December 31st at 11:59 p.m. And if it's any earlier than that, I'll be pleasantly surprised.
Do you think, like, based on that, like, we'll see a lot of like where do you see that makes? I got to phrase this right. Where do you see open sourcing DocC? How will that change the future, or how will that affect the future of DocC?
I think the biggest thing that it will do is really open a lot more gateways for generating static sites and integrating it with existing documentation tooling like Jazzy and things like that. Because I think there's at least a little bit of reluctance to sort of start building that for some things, just because it's like, well, this is going to be publicly documented and we want to wait until this is like the JSON definition is stable and all that kind of stuff. And then like once that's actually stable, then sort of plugging that into existing documentation tooling is much more plausible. And I think that's where you're going to really start to see like things where you can do static stuff or like React apps or whatever. You know, and you know, our front end team is very much a React shop. So it's something where it's just like, oh yeah, you want to use Vue? Okay. And you know, it's definitely something where having that be something that's easier to interact with in a way that's familiar to the front end developers that you work with is really important. And I'm sure something will come out for Angular too. Like I think Vue and Angular and React are sort of the three biggest front end things. And you know, you also could just have something that puts out just the dumbest HTML you could possibly imagine, and doesn't involve any JavaScript and just loads everything. And you know, I know that there's a number of iOS developers who are like, ew, JavaScript, but it's like, you know, there are a lot of nice things that it can do. But it is something where it's just like, yeah, if you want to be able to have your whole site load and have no script equals true, yeah, you can probably do that.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see what tooling gets built on top of it. But I think it is something where having it be open sourced is really encouraging, because I think once it's actually completely open source, like if people have problems with it, they can at least start to like submit potential patches. The other thing is that, you get a much clearer idea of like, okay, here's how I can integrate this, and here's how this all works under the hood. Right. I'm really, really happy that Apple's been open sourcing much more of this stuff, because it really,
right.
it really does make a lot of stuff a lot easier when you can just go and be like, oh, that's why this is doing this. Okay.
Right. You can see what's going on under the hood, like you said. So yeah. Anything else you wanted to mention before we close out?
Yeah, I'm like weeks behind in submitting all my radars to the Apple team. I'm like, I'm totally going to submit those radars. And then it's like, I was totally going to submit those radars. So I've got a bunch of stuff that I need to put together. But
what's been your biggest hang up, I guess, with the new OSes? Besides async and await, we won't even get into that can of worms, but
it's so sad. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really had a lot of major problems with the new OSes yet, but that's mostly from lack of use. Okay. Most of what I've been working on is very sort of under the hood stuff. Well,
if it's GraphQL, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we still have to support. We're still supporting iOS 12. I need to like talk to a bunch of our biggest customers and be like, "Hi, can I talk you out of using iOS 12?"
Yeah, that's surprising. Like, I would think like, okay, maybe like they have some sort of idea of when they're going to sunset it, but yeah, okay.
So some of them do, some of them don't, and there's a huge array of factors to that, particularly for anything that does video. So the same devices that run 11 run 12, and then the same devices that run 13 also run 14 and 15. So 12 is a point where like older devices drop off, and especially for places that do video, and especially if it's video for kids. People give their kid their old iPad.
Yeah, exactly.
And and then they're not mad when the kid like throws it across the room because they're mad that Peppa Pig didn't do what they wanted Peppa Pig to do. It's something where like that deprecation path, I think, is really critical. And I think it is something where, for a lot of places, you can sort of, in the past, one of the big justifications I've made for updating is like, if we drop, iOS 12 support, that doesn't mean that the people who have the app right now on iOS 12, just like it like deletes itself from their iPad. They still have it. They still are able to continue to use it. The people who are giving us money already from this are able to continue to give us money.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And that's when you're talking to project managers, that's always a helpful way to frame things.
Yeah.
But it's something where like, yeah, like there's some places where it's like, well, only 1% to 2% of our audience uses iOS 12. That's still like, but our audience is so huge that's like $3 million a month. And, that's something where when you start working with stuff that's at that scale, then those arguments get much more drawn out. And I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to go to 13 soonish, just because the couple of things that will open up for us are using the URL session WebSocket instead of Starscream, which has been a little bit of a mess. And then the other one is Combine, because there's a lot of stuff that we use where it's just like, yes, do this, then that, then the other thing, and boy, do we have a lot of pyramids of doom.
Reactive scaffolding that you've had to build yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. So it would be it would be really nice if we could take advantage of that. And, I think there's a certain point where you do have to sort of say, okay, like, let's make this happen. But I think one of the disadvantages of working on a framework is that you do not just have to convince your bosses to drop that it's okay to drop support for iOS 12. You have to convince all of your customers' bosses that it's okay to drop support for iOS 12. And
that's interesting.
I think once 15's been out for more than a couple of days, I think that's going to be much easier. But yeah, it's a whole thing.
Yeah, I've heard that's exactly what I've been hearing is like, yeah, we don't know when we're dropping iOS. Like before it was we're dropping iOS 12 right away. And then now it's like, yeah, we're going to see how many people install iOS 15. And I think it's pretty convincing. Like I don't have the kid audience that you have, which makes more sense. But like, yeah, I just don't, there's so many advantages to 13, just 13 alone, that it's pretty momentous.
And
cool.
I think that's something that's really big for a lot of places. It's where you can start to use Swift UI. It's where you can start to use Combine.
Right.
And that's something that's been a really big incentive for a lot of people. And in terms of just like, hey, there's entire classes of bugs that we can just make go away. Like that's always a nice right. Thing. And I think one of the things that I always like to do is just sort of like, if you have a bunch of bugs, especially if they're in some kind of like Trello or Jira or something, just tag all the ones where it's just like, if we weren't still supporting iOS 12, this wouldn't exist. Because then
can you imagine in like 2 or 3 years, you'll be able to say the same thing with async and wait? It's like, if we drop iOS 14 support, all these bugs will go away because we'll be on async and wait.
Yeah, that would be nice. It sounded like they're still working on the idea of like, can we do sort of a support library for async awake? So like essentially backport it to older versions of.
Yeah, Doug has that pull request draft out on GitHub that I'll hopefully link to.
It's all still kind of like, we think we can do this, maybe, possibly. It's really hard, but like, it would be really nice if that was plausible.
Yeah. Just the sugar, just the syntactic sugar of it would be nice alone.
I mean, it's definitely something that like, there's a bunch of places where it's like Combine is definitely what you want to use because you're trying to do sort of
plug
more
in a bunch of things.
More sophisticated pipelines. But there are a bunch of places where it's just like, I just want to know when this comes back. So just tell me when you're done.
Right. And not have to write your own promise. Anything else you wanted to talk about before we end this?
No. I pick up my new iPhone tomorrow, so I have no comment on it yet.
Which one did you get?
So, I got the 13 Pro. I've been on the 11 Pro for a while, and I kind of gone to an every 2-year update cycle. But yeah, it's funny because like we have like this sort of long chain of like, okay, my old phone becomes my wife's new phone, which and her old phone becomes her mom's new phone, and it's just like, okay, yeah.
I love my 11 Pro Max. I'm holding on to it. Tightly. So I'm
11 Pro is a really nice phone.
It's a fantastic phone. I love it. I bought it last year used, and I love it.
Yeah, I cracked because of the new camera stuff. I in non-COVID times I do a lot of traveling, and the 11 Pro was really the first one that I was able to take with me and just use it completely in place of a point and shoot.
Oh wow! Okay.
And what I'm really excited about with the 13 Pro is that it gets up to 3x zoom, which when you're dealing with like super high end point and shoots, like that's about as high as the zoom goes. You can get some point and shoots that have something bananas like 16x zoom, but like they don't handle the color quite as well and things like that.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it's nice, and it's just one less thing to carry around with you. And,
totally.
Part of the reason I went to like high end point and shoots is because I used to carry a digital SLR around with me, and then I was like, is really heavy.
Yeah. Yep.
And
yep.
like,
I sold all my digital cameras a few years ago because I was just like,
yeah,
these are awesome cameras, but like I don't have the space for them with all the kids stuff and everything else. It's like, no, I don't want to deal with this. It's not worth it.
I think the other thing that I've seen is just like I've had so many friends who've had digital SLRs stolen. And it's not like that's not a problem with phones, but it's also something where.
But also,
like,
you can make it useless. Like if somebody steals your phone, they can't do anything with it. So,
and it's also something where just like it makes you less of a target when you're walking around, just because like, you know, if you're just pulling out your phone and taking pictures, you just look like some rando who lives in the neighborhood. Whereas if you're just like, ooh, look at my giant camera, that really marks you as a tourist, and people are just like, all right, sounds good.
So my last question then is, when are we going to see some DocC documentation for Apollo with some cinematic videos that take advantage of your new, because you got to write it off, right? Your iPhone 13 Pro.
Oh, clearly. Yeah, no, I don't know if I'm going to be doing anything within the documentation, but yeah, there will be some, I am going to be working on some videos for our YouTube channel. So
awesome.
But yeah, I'm hoping
with the rack focus.
Yeah, I'm hoping to make some changes that will make it workable for documentation within Xcode to work well. Nice. Getting it to a point where it's actually going to be integrated with our whole documentation system is going to be a little bit more work, just because we are more of a React shop than a Vue shop, and like we're going to have to figure out how to get everything into a static.
Right. And that's where the open sourcing will be really nice.
That's where I'm really hoping that will come in handy. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ellen, for coming on the show. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Designated Nerd. Yeah, I tweet a lot. It's probably not good. And yeah, that's my main thing online. And I'll be doing a lot more stuff through the Apollo GraphQL YouTube and Twitch channels. I'm gonna be starting Twitch, the live stream, which is good. Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah, it turns out that if you never can leave your house, you don't have an audience, and that sucks. But it turns out that if you do live streaming occasionally, you can have something resembling an audience. So
yes, yeah, that's awesome. Fantastic. Good luck with that. We'll have links to all your stuff in our show notes below. Cool. Folks can find me on Twitter at LeoGDion. My company is Bright Digit. Please take some time to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or post a positive review on your podcast player of choice. Look forward to talking to you again, and thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.